Welcome back to MadEmmyify True Crime. 2 videos in 2 weeks. It's unheard of on this channel. Today is part 2 of my Titanic, I don't really want to say deep dive, but I suppose it kind of is. If you missed part 1, there'll be a link in the description. Part 1 was all about the building of the Titanic. Today I will be discussing the voyage and the sinking of the Titanic. I am joined by Rossi today. He is currently sat on my knee. I'm sure he will pop his head up at least once and of course not be a distraction in any way. Anyway, I'm going to dive straight into part 2 of the Titanic. Titanic left Southampton and headed to Cherbourg. The crossing was smooth and not a lot happened aside from the small matter of a coal fire in Bunker 6. Coal fires aboard ships were pretty common back then and usually caused by the spontaneous combustion of coal. The easiest way to put out such a fire would be to dig out as much coal as possible, so that's what the stokers set to work doing. The Titanic stopped at Cherbourg, where 22 passengers disembarked and a further 274 got aboard. Then at 8:10 p.m, Titanic left Cherbourg to sail the 307 miles to Queenstown, which is now called Cobb, I believe, in Ireland. Apologies if you're Irish and I've just butchered that pronunciation. Again, the journey was smooth, with just that still raging coal fire to worry about. At 11:30 a.m. on April the 11th, 1912, Titanic dropped anchor at Queenstown. 7 passengers disembarked and 120 came aboard. Of those passengers, 113 were third-class passengers. At 1:30 p.m, Titanic raised anchor for the last time and began the 2,825-mile journey to New York. Now, when I do state miles, some of these may be nautical miles, some of these may be miles. It wasn't always clear in the sources, so if it does seem like, if it does seem like some are less or more than they should be, it's probably because that reference was nautical miles. As Titanic left Ireland, she followed along the Irish coast to Fastnet Rock. From there, she travelled 1,860 miles along the Great Circle route across the North Atlantic to reach a spot known as the Corner, southeast of Newfoundland, where it's common for westbound steamers to change course. She travelled at an average speed of 21 knots. The journey was uneventful. The first-class passengers enjoyed their hors d'oeuvres and cigars, sipping their cognac and being offended by poor people. What the rich do. Up until April the 13th, the weather remained very mild, but on April the 14th she encountered a cold weather front with strong winds and 8-foot waves. But as the day progressed, the wind died down, and on April the 14th, the fire in the coal bunker was also finally extinguished. A lifeboat drill was originally meant to take place on April the 14th. However, this was cancelled by the captain for reasons we'll never know, because Captain Smith went down with the ship. As night fell, the weather turned suddenly very cold. As I mentioned in part 1, Titanic was fitted with a Marconi telegraph and 2 Marconi-employed operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. They were aboard to send Marconigrams on behalf of the first-class passengers. It would cost you 12 shillings and sixpence, or the equivalent of £48.86 in modern money, for the first 10 words, and 9p or £2.93 in modern money per word for everything after that. Titanic received a series of warnings from other ships of drifting ice in the area. Off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, Titanic continued at full speed, which wasn't that odd for the time. There was, it would be quite common to carry on at that speed if the ice warnings were just an advisory. there was some implication after the sinking that the speed was due to a shortage of coal due to the coal strike that had been happening in England. I did mention that briefly at the end of part 1, but the coal strike had finished a few days earlier, so it's kind of hotly debated, like, they would have had the provisions for the coal. Phillips was overwhelmed by the volume of incoming and outgoing telegrams, specifically because one passenger was wanting to notify all interested about an upcoming poker game in Los Angeles. The radio operators failed to pass on several ice warnings. Bruce Ismay, Titanic's owner, and Captain Smith decided the ocean conditions were optimal and they shouldn't slow, though Smith did order a change of course to warmer southern waters. Now we're going to go through kind of like a breakdown of all events of that night. There might be some repetition of what was happening in the wireless room. At 6 p.m, Second Officer Charles Lightoller took the helm. He commented that the sea was like glass that night. The temperature had dropped to the point where many passengers didn't even want to brave being on deck. At 7:15 p.m, Harold Bride decided to turn off the wireless radio system and allow it to cool down a bit. The previous day it had overheated, and this had created a backlog of messages while they'd waited for it to cool down and get back online. With Lightoller at the helm, Smith dined with some of Titanic's most prestigious passengers. By 8:55 p.m, Captain Smith returned to the bridge where he and Lightoller discussed the weather conditions. Lightoller told Smith that it is only 1 degree above freezing. I've sent word down to the carpenter and rung up the engine room and told them it will be freezing during the night. Captain Smith decided to retire for the evening, but reminded Lightoller to slow the ship if conditions became hazy, as well as inform the crow's nest to look out for icebergs. By 9:30 p.m, the radio room made contact with mainland America. Because of the massive telegrams, Harold Bride made a fateful decision not to pass on an ice warning from the nearby steamer Mesaba. The warning was of pack ice and large bergs. Shortly after this, Jack Phillips took over the telegraph. He assumed Bride had passed on the ice warnings to the bridge. Around 10 p.m, the lights in the public rooms in both second and third class were put out to encourage passengers to head to their cabins, whilst the cigars, drinks and conversations continued to flow in the first class lounges. Lightoller handed the helm to First Officer William Murdoch. As he handed over, the two discussed the weather conditions and Captain Smith's wishes if the visibility were to change. Lightoller inspected the decks and then went to bed. At 10:40 p.m, an overworked and stressed Phillips received a loud message from SS California. "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." Phillips's call name seemed to be Old Man, I think because Harold Bride was the younger of the two. So a lot of the telegrams called him Old Man. It wasn't like an insult or anything. To which he replied, "Shut up, I am busy." After this exchange, California's wireless operator switched off the receiver and went to bed. The ocean was calm, the air was clear, but there was no moon. Because of the calmness of the water, there was nothing that would give away the position of any icebergs, and a mix-up at Southampton had meant that the lookouts had no binoculars, though these would have not likely helped much in the darkness. At 11:39 p.m, lookout Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg in Titanic's path. He rang the lookout bell 3 times and phoned the bridge to inform the 6th Officer, James Moody, iceberg right ahead. William Murdoch is generally believed to have given the order hard a starboard, which would mean the ship would be turned to port. Murdoch was likely attempting to port around the iceberg, a manoeuvre where you swing the bow around an obstacle followed by the stern so both ends avoid the collision. I believe it may have been, don't quote me on this, a similar thing that the Costa Concordia attempted to do when they went into the rock and capsized. There was a delay before the order could be carried out, as the steam-powered steering took 30 seconds to turn the tiller and reversing the ship's engines took time. Ironically, if Murdoch had kept the ship going forward, Titanic might have missed the iceberg by mere feet. In 2010, the granddaughter of Charles Lightoller claimed the helmsman had initially panicked and turned the rudder in the wrong direction. Bruce Ismay had ordered Titanic to continue slow ahead, believing it was unsinkable, but this was apparently covered up due to the insurance implications it would have had. Titanic's heading changed just in time to avoid a head-on collision, but the iceberg caught a glancing blow against the ship. An underwater spur of ice scraped along the starboard side of the ship for 7 seconds. Chunks of ice dislodged from the berg and fell onto the forward decks. Those who survived the sinking would recall the impact as a mild, unexpected vibration that at the time seemed insignificant, but already water was pouring into Titanic's lower decks as the collision forced the metal hull to buckle inwards and rivets popped below the waterline. The first 5 compartments were opened up to the sea. As the forward compartments filled, the watertight doors closed, and any sailors in these compartments would have immediately been drowned. Titanic could stay afloat with 4 compartments flooding, but she was taking on water in 5 and a 6th compartment was beginning to flood. Captain Smith arrived at the bridge and ordered an all stop, and all the ship's engines were turned off. It became apparent that Titanic would sink. At 12:05 a.m. on April the 15th, Captain Smith ordered the ship's lifeboats uncovered and the passengers mustered. He also ordered the radio operators to begin sending distress calls. Titanic's first distress call used was CQD, which was a call sign commonly used by British telegraphers, meaning CQ plus the D for distress or danger. Harold Bride at the time was relaxed enough to joke that perhaps they should try SOS, as it was a new signal and it may be their last chance to use it. It's a common misconception that SOS means save our ship or save our souls, but it's actually an adaptation of a German radio call, and it's simple to tap out and understand in an emergency. SOS had been officially ratified as the official international distress call in 1908, but British and Marconi operators had been slower to adopt it. The thoroughness of the muster was heavily dependent on the class of the passenger. First class stewards only had a few passengers to attend to compared to those assigned to second and third class. While first class stewards provided hands-on assistance, those for second and third class focused on opening doors below deck and telling passengers to put on their life vests. It's actually a common misconception that there were not enough life vests on the Titanic. There were more than enough life vests for every passenger. There was over 3,000 life vests. The passengers were not told the ship was sinking, though a few did notice that she was listing to one side. Meanwhile, on the Carpathia, Harold Cottam, the ship's wireless operator, returned from the bridge and decided to listen to transmissions, even though his shift has ended. He was he was getting ready for bed, he was unlacing his boots, he just had the device on. He received a message from Cape Cod stating they had private traffic for Titanic. Thinking he would be helpful, at 12:11 a.m. he sent a message to Titanic. In return, he received the distress call stating they had struck an iceberg and needed urgent assistance. Cottam went straight to the bridge, where the officers were sceptical about the seriousness of the distress call. Agitated, Cottam decided to wake up Carpathia's captain, Arthur Henry Rostron. Now, this guy is just... I'll get into him a bit more in part 3, but he is hero. decided to wake up Arthur Henry Rostron. He sprang into action, sending for the chief engineer to tell him to call another watch of stokers and make all speed to the Titanic. Carpathia was 67 miles away from Titanic at the time. Rostron ordered the ship's heating and hot water cut in order to divert all steam to the engine room. Extra lookouts were also put in place to watch for icebergs. Cotton, meanwhile, messaged Titanic to let them know that the Carpathia was coming as quickly as possible and they expected to arrive in 4 hours. Cotton refrained from sending any more signals in an attempt to keep the network free so that Titanic could send out her SOS. After the initial order by the stewards to put on life belts, many passengers thought this was a joke. Some even began playing football with the chunks of ice on the foredecks. Meanwhile, crew began preparing lifeboats on the boat deck. The boat deck at the time would have been very noisy, which might have been another reason why the passengers were perhaps unwilling to go up there. The boilers of the Titanic had been put out and the build-up of steam needed to be vented to prevent an explosion. They also needed to keep venting the steam so that when the cold water hit the boilers didn't explode. And these had to be vented via the whistles and funnels on the boat deck. One survivor described the sound as being as loud as 20 locomotives, and it was so loud that the crew had to use hand signals to communicate because they couldn't hear each other speak. At the time, lifeboats were intended to be used as a method to transport passengers off of a distressed ship onto another nearby vessel. So it was common for ocean liners to have too few lifeboats than the ship's full capacity. In fact, of the 39 British liners that were over 10,000 tonnes, like an equivalent to the Titanic, 33 had too few lifeboats. By 12:20 a.m, 40 minutes after the collision, the loading of the lifeboats was underway. Captain Smith gave the order to put women and children in and lower away to Second Officer Lightoller and First Officer Murdoch. Lightoller took charge of loading boats on the port side while Murdoch took the starboard side. Unfortunately, both men took the evacuation order of women and children differently, with Murdoch taking it to mean women and children first, and Lightoller taking it to mean women and children only. This meant Lightoller lowered boats with empty seats if no women or children were waiting to board, which at this point there weren't that many passengers up on the boat deck, so there might not have been women and children, while Murdoch allowed a limited number of men to board if no women and children were waiting. Neither officer actually knew the safe capacity of the lifeboats due to the lack of any lifeboat drills. I think they'd run one in Southampton, but that was it. Both men erred on the side of caution, but by not filling the boats fully. Had the lifeboats been filled, an additional 500 people could have been saved. Instead, hundreds of mostly men were left on board. At 12:45 a.m, the first lifeboat, which was lifeboat number 7, was rowed away from Titanic. Meanwhile, below deck, crew fought to maintain vital services as water continued to pour into the ship below decks. The engineers and firemen continued to work venting steam from the boilers to prevent explosions. They opened up watertight doors to set up extra portable pumps in the forward compartments in a futile bid to reduce the torrents of water. I think the pumps could pump out, I think it was 2,000 litres every hour, and that was coming in every 5 minutes into the Titanic. They also worked to keep the ship's electrics running. One of the stewards, F. Dent Ray, narrowly avoided being swept away when a wooden wall between his quarters and third-class accommodation on E-deck collapsed, leaving him waist-deep in freezing water. Jonathan Shepherd broke his leg while battling to pump water out of Boiler Room 5. He and Herbert Harvey, unfortunately, both lost their lives when the door separating Boiler Room 5 and 6 collapsed, causing them to be swept away by a wave of green foam, according to the lead fireman, who barely managed to escape himself. In boiler room 4 at around 1:20 a.m, water began flowing from below. This flow of water overwhelmed the pumps and forced the firemen and trimmers to evacuate the forward boiler rooms. Further aft, which is towards the stern or the back of the ship, Chief Engineer Bell, some of the engineers and a handful of firemen and greasers stayed behind in the unflooded boiler rooms, which was 1, 2 and 3, as well as the turbine and reciprocating engine room, keeping the ship's lights and pumps operating. Late into the sinking, when they realised there was nothing more that could be done, they came up onto the deck, but by that point all the lifeboats had left and none of Titanic's 35 engineers and electricians survived, and neither did Titanic's 5 postal clerks, who spent most of the time trying to save all of the mail that was aboard the Titanic. Interestingly enough, though, none of the mail has ever actually been recovered from the wreckage, though I suppose it being paper, it probably disintegrated quite quickly. Stepping back in time a little and back to the boat deck. Initially, passengers had been reluctant to leave the warm, well-lit Titanic, which showed no signs of immediate danger. This was part of the reason that some lifeboats were lowered half empty. It was hoped that some of these boats would come back and help those in the water, and some passengers were also unsure about how sturdy the lifeboats were. Bruce Ismay, White Star's managing director, left on collapsible lifeboat C, something he was heavily criticised for in both the British and American inquiry, and he was murdered in the press for this. Other passengers, including Father Thomas Biles and Margaret Brown, who became known as Unsinkable Molly Brown, there'll be a little bit more on her later, helped women and children into lifeboats. Eventually, 2 men grabbed Brown by the arms and forced her into lifeboat 6. She survived, unfortunately, Biles did not. By 1:25 a.m, the situation on the lifeboat deck became chaotic as passengers realised that there were far more people than places on lifeboats. The boarding of the lifeboats became increasingly rushed and disorganised, with some entering the water overloaded and in a very rushed manner. One woman fell between lifeboat 10 and the side of the ship, but was luckily caught and hauled back up before boarding successfully. Annie Stengel, a first-class passenger, broke several ribs when an overweight German-American doctor and his brother jumped into lifeboat 5 and knocked her unconscious. As lifeboat 6 was lowered, it nearly became flooded by water discharging from the ship's side, but was successfully lowered. Lifeboat number 3 nearly tipped all the passengers out of it when a divot became jammed. Part of the problem was that, as this was Titanic's maiden voyage, few of the crew had training or understanding of how to expel these lifeboats safely. When lifeboat 14 was lowered, 5th Officer Lowe was forced to fire 3 shots from his gun to deter passengers from leaping from the deck into the boat. Lifeboat 11 was also almost lowered directly into one of Titanic's pumps, but was pushed away with an oar, saving 70 lives of those on board. By 1:35, lifeboats 15 and 16 left the ship, meaning all lifeboats in the second class section were gone. 6 lifeboats were left. These were located in first class and had a combined capacity of 293. There was still an estimated 1,800 still aboard at this point. A major turning point occurred at 1:40 a.m. when the holes of the bow anchor dipped under the water. This allowed water to flood the rest of the bow, which to this point had remained dry. A few minutes later, the ship lurched forward suddenly as below deck the watertight bulkhead between boilers 5 and 6 collapsed. This bulkhead had been weakened by the fire that had been raging for days. This sudden movement and the increased angle of tilt further alerted the passengers to the impending danger, and there was an outbreak of panic. At 1:45 a.m, Titanic's wireless signal became faint, indicating that the electrics had failed and that the reserve batteries were in use. There is a rumour that that Titanic's electric stayed on till the final 5 minutes, but that kind of conflicts with the story from the Carpathia, so I don't know. Collapsible C left Titanic at around 2 a.m, followed by D 5 minutes later, as Lifeboat 4 tried to help people caught in the freezing ocean. As Titanic continued to sink, telegraph operators Bride and Phillips began switching between SOS and CQD. Their distress calls were sloppily relayed. They could also only send or receive one message at a time. The line was repeatedly tied up with irrelevant questions and confused operators. Amateur radio operators also interfered with Titanic's message. It was through this that the news of Titanic's sinking first reached New York. At 2:05, the seawater reached the bottom of the bridge rail. All lifeboats, apart from collapsibles A and B, which were awkwardly located, had been lowered. When B was lowered, it had just 3 spare seats. At this point, Titanic's bronze propeller began to rise above the waterline in front of Lifeboat 2, which was located just off the stern. Water began flooding the forward deck through crew hatches on the bridge. At this time, Captain Smith released Harold Bride and Jack Phillips from their duties before quietly wandering off into the bridge. Bride went to gather money from their quarters while Phillips continued working. When Bride returned, he found a fireman attempting to steal Phillips's life vest. Bride and Phillips managed to knock this man unconscious. As water began entering the radio room, both men ran onto the deck. Bride helped with collapsible B, whilst Phillips ran to the aft of the ship. At this time, Carpathia had travelled 24 miles and was 34 miles from Titanic's position. As the last two lifeboats left the ship, collapsible A half filled with water, collapsible B capsized and 30 men clung to it. Shortly after, the forward expansion joint, which was located behind the first funnel, was pulled apart by the weight of the rising stern. This put strain on 2 of the funnel's cable stays. The cable snapped and the funnel fell forward, crushing the starboard boat wing. On deck, people scrambled for the stern or jumped overboard to attempt to reach a lifeboat. Father Biles spent his final moments reciting prayers, hearing confessions, and giving absolution to those huddled around him. The ship's stern rose about 15 to 35 degrees until 2:18 a.m, when the ship's electrics went out permanently and the second funnel broke off and fell into the water. Around the same time, the structure beneath funnel 3 completely split. This caused Titanic to split in half. As it fell, hundreds were crushed. As the split was near a rear expansion joint, this caused the bow to go completely under. The third and fourth funnels fell shortly after. I'm sorry if that bit was not worded the best. Basically, the ship split and the third and fourth funnels fell. And when the ship split, it changed the angle of the tilt. Apparently, initially, a lot of the crew were told to say that Titanic didn't split in half, but it was proved that it did, or some people said it did. I'm kind of working on the inquiry, so I might expand on that a little bit more when I do part 3. The stern section was pulled up by the sinking bow and the weight of the engines. This was only temporary, and the stern soon sank below the icy waters, 2 hours and 40 minutes after it struck the iceberg. When the stern was pulled up, a lot of the people in the lifeboats thought it was a miracle and that section of the ship was going to survive. But they obviously quickly realised that wasn't the case. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking, hundreds of passengers and crew were left dying in the icy sea surrounded by debris. As some of the debris rocketed to the surface from the sinking ship, this likely killed and injured many of the swimmers. At -2 degrees, the water was lethally cold. Almost all of those in the water died of cardiac arrest or other body reactions to the freezing water within 15 to 30 minutes. It's wrongly believed that they died of hypothermia. Those on the lifeboats would have been overwhelmed by the sounds of screams, followed by an eerie silence. At this point, the Carpathia was still around 1 hour away from Titanic's location. It was forced to slow to avoid the icebergs. As I mentioned earlier, Molly Brown was in Lifeboat 6. She took an oar in the lifeboat to help sail it and urged Quartermaster Robert Hitchens to let them turn around to save more people. The two argued, and eventually Molly, sick of his behaviour, threatened to throw him overboard. It's not known whether they did row back. They probably wouldn't have found anyone still alive by the point they rowed back anyway. And a lot of the lifeboats didn't go back because A, they were worried that when the ship sunk it would create a vacuum and pull the lifeboat down, or that all these people in the water would somehow overwhelm the lifeboat trying to climb in to save themselves. But realistically, a lot of them would have probably been too weak. Like the cold shock would already be setting in. Even though there was an extra capacity of 500 in the lifeboats, only 13 people were pulled from the water. Those in the lifeboats had no food or water, and most had no lights because they weren't standard on a lifeboat back then. Collapsible B, which had capsized, was kept afloat only by a small pocket of air in the upturned hull. As dawn approached, the sea became choppy, forcing those on the collapsed boat to stand up to balance. Some, exhausted, fell off the boat and drowned. At 4 a.m. on April the 15th, Carpathia arrived. It took several hours for those in the lifeboats to be brought aboard. Those left on Collapsible B managed to board 2 of the other boats, but 1 person died before the transfer. Collapsible A was in a lot worse condition. More than half of those aboard had died overnight. 3 bodies were left in the Collapsible, and it was recovered a month later by Oceanic, with the bodies still aboard. The survivors came aboard by various means, with children being lifted in mail sacks, and by 9:15 a.m, California and Mount Temple both appeared on the scene. They attempted to find survivors, of which there were none. Carpathia had been bound for Rijeka in Croatia, but without the facilities to cater for these survivors, Rostron ordered the ship be turned round and they returned to New York. I hope you will join me next week for part 3. I know I haven't mentioned final death counts, but that is coming in part 3. And I do also think that I am going to make this 4 parts, just because the inquiry and the lawsuits and everything else may end up stretching it out a bit. So part 4 may just kind of be everything after the sinking, such as the discovery of the wreck, and stuff like that. But we shall see. I'm still undecided. I'm still making notes. I've still not finished writing part 3. To be fair, I only started it yesterday. Anyway, I'm rambling, so I hope that I have educated and informed you. Please come back next week. Hopefully I will have learned to talk, because I seem to be struggling to talk today. Good night, and don't have nightmares.